Why now? Why does a civil rights movement begin to emerge at this particular moment in time? The injustices it challenges and the goals it promotes are hardly new.
I think the place to start understanding the civil rights movement is World War II. I think the fight against racism of the Nazi sort raises the consciousness of millions of Americans about the evils of racism in ways they had not thought about them before.
There is this feeling which begins with Roosevelt and continues through Truman and even Eisenhower of what we call rising expectations. There is a sense after World War II that there's no turning back. There's no turning back the tide.
Many African-American veterans come home and they find that they are still second-rate citizens. And so this intellectual tension and this emotional tension that comes out of World War II, I think is translated into the civil rights movement.
As World War II quickly glides into the Cold War, the United States really has every interest in winning over the hearts and minds of the non-aligned nations, which for the most part are peoples of color in Africa and Asia and Latin America to a certain extent.
It becomes preposterous and extraordinary that the United States would purport to lead a world which it calls free without granting citizenship to a huge part of its population.
White Americans who perhaps would not otherwise have been concerned with the struggle for civil rights became concerned because it was no longer simply about the rights of African Americans in the United States. It was about a geopolitical struggle for world control.
So ironically, it's the imperatives of the Cold War in a certain sense that really make possible some of the civil rights victories of the 50s and 60s.
Changing demographics within the United States itself also plays a role.
Outmigration of African Americans to other parts of the country is a major contribution to the civil rights movement, because Southerners leave the South, they go to northern cities, they build up a political presence in northern cities, which provides some political capital.
I do recall vividly in 1953 visiting Louisiana, and there was a mix-up about the train I was coming on, so I wasn't met. And I wandered into the black waiting room, and people looked at me very strangely, and finally somebody said, no, no, white boy, you belong over there. And even though I'd read about this, I was so dumb, I couldn't figure out, what's going on here? What do you mean? And I mean, it was so bizarre to someone growing up in Michigan.
As business and industry gains a greater foothold in the South, this disparity in racial attitudes becomes cause for concern.
Its economic leaders were now having to clearly answer to boards of directors who found segregation to be problematic for their bottom line. And so, in one way, the economy is breaking down the bonds that had sustained Jim Crow.